Okay, everybody, good afternoon. I'm Larry Rinder. I'm the director and chief curator of the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. This is an event I've been looking forward to for a very long time, our mini symposium on the work of Frederick Hammersley. And as I'm sure you're aware, this symposium is being held in conjunction with our current exhibition, Looking, the Art of Frederick Hammersley, which I organized together with Elaine Yau, who is our Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow, and you'll be hearing more from Elaine soon. The exhibition runs through June 23rd, and so please send your friends, come back yourselves and take a look. There's time this evening to look at it some more. Our galleries are open till 7, so please check it out again and again. The exhibition, as you've probably noticed if you've been in there, covers a wide range of Hammersley's work, and I think the show is kind of distinctive for that fact. Even though it's a small show, it's very broad. But even so, there are some bits and pieces of his practice that are not there, and I hope maybe you'll hear about some of those today. The famous Hunch paintings, for example, are not represented. Maybe someday we'll get a Hunch painting. That's a goal for the museum. But before I go into a little bit more about the exhibition, I want to give our deep, deep thanks to the Hamersley Foundation, which made possible this exhibition, indeed donated the entire body of work that you see on view, and has helped with all of the expenses pertaining to today's event and other things. Kathleen Shields, who couldn't be here with us today, was particularly wonderful in guiding us through this process, so thank you, Kathleen, wherever you are. Elaine Yau, who I mentioned before, really took on a very big part of this project, leading a lot of the research. She wrote a really wonderful essay in this little catalog, which I think you can still get copies of in the store. She was also our lead on developing the video, which you can see in the gallery. So Elaine, thank you for coming along for the ride. And Elaine will be giving a talk and moderating the panel as well. So thanks. Elaine is going to introduce the distinguished panel later, which will include James Glisson, Leslie Jones, David Pagel, and Joseph Traugott. But before I turn it over to them, I just wanted to give a brief overview of Hammersley, his biography, and his work, and with a few examples, images from the show, and with a little bit of a focus on the photography, because this is an aspect of his work that has really been, I think, the least explored in previous exhibitions, and I don't think any of our panelists are going to touch on photography. So I wanted to say a little something about that. So can we have first presentation, which I hope is mine? Do I have to do anything? Elaine will help yet again.
There we go.
Oh. Here we go. There we go. All better. Okay, thank you. So I never met Frederick Hammersley, and I think some of the folks here did, particularly our presenters, and so hopefully we'll get some personal insight into him. To me, as a museum curator, Hammersley is something of an enigma, and I think even to people who knew him, he was a little bit of an enigma. He seemed to be a person of multiple facets, sometimes contradictory, and I think you see that in the exhibition. There was a sort of a bifurcation between a direction towards extreme order and control and another direction that was sort of the opposite, an embrace of intuition and openness, randomness, and chance. He seemed to have quite a sense of humor about all of this, I think. Even though I never met him, I can kind of just get a sense of his dry wit underlying a lot of his work and practice. And you get a taste of that in the titles of his work, which are replete with puns and things of this nature. Hammersley was born in 1919 in Salt Lake City, and he attended the University of Idaho, and then briefly the Academy of Advertising Arts, which is now the Academy of Art University. And as that would suggest, his initial career goal was to be a commercial artist, and he did quite a lot of graphic design for advertising and things of that nature. He went to Los Angeles in 1940 to attend Chouinard, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is the predecessor of CalArts. But then in 1942, he was drafted into the Army, where he served in the Signal Corps, which was sort of the communications-focused branch of the Army. They did everything from maintaining, telegraph lines to actually doing signs and things like that. And I think that may be largely what Hammersley was involved with, was sign painting and things of that kind, graphic design for the Army. He didn't, as far as I know, see any battles or anything like that. He wasn't that kind of soldier, but he did arrive in Paris about a week after the liberation. So he was almost in the thick of it. And this photograph, which is from the group that we have out in the corridor, is, in my view, a truly remarkable image for a number of reasons. You have to imagine that at this point, Hammersley is, a 20-something young. He wasn't a private exactly. I think he was a sergeant, but not much above a private in the Army. Just arrived in Paris, and somehow he insinuates himself into this exceptionally historic moment where we have, at the Arc de Triomphe, Dwight Eisenhower, flanked by Marie-Pierre Koenig, who was the head of the Free French Forces of the Interior, William Tedder, who was the Marshal of the RAF, the head of the Royal Air Force of Britain, and Georges-Augustin Bidault, who was the fellow on the far left, who was the head of the French resistance. So this is really about as illustrious a group of people that you could possibly have assembled in Europe at that particular moment. This was a victory march. There were several victory marches sort of every day for about a week after the liberation, and this was one of them. It started at the Arc de Triomphe and went down to the maybe the Palais Royal or something like that. But anyway, there was Hammersley, obviously, right in front of these people, snapping his camera. Hammersley loved to take photographs. He took a lot during the war, and then later when he moved back to Los Angeles, and then even later when he was in Albuquerque. One does get the sense that many of the photographs that he took were taken, in effect, as snapshots, or just to capture a moment or a memory, the same way that any of us take pictures. And yet he did present them on at least 2 occasions as art, and the works that we have in the corridor here comprised an entire exhibition that he had at Cal State Northridge, and he selected these 50 photographs and printed them for that exhibition. So that was a milestone in his career and really indicates that he saw this as a coherent body of work. The reason I'm showing it, the image sort of relatively small surrounded by all that white, is that is how he printed them, and you can see there's some text written on the bottom that you can barely read, but we wanted to preserve that sort of full frame of the page. Hammersley was very idiosyncratic about all his decisions, and so it's best to do it the way he did it, even if we don't understand exactly why. Maybe someday someone will. In Paris, he also, like many of the GIs who were there right after liberation, had the opportunity to visit artist studios. And this is a wonderful, I think, very charming photograph that he took in Picasso's, actually not studio, this is in Picasso's bedroom. And how he got into the bedroom, I'm not quite sure, but there it is. There's Picasso's wonderful Afghan hound, kind of a famous dog if you're into Picasso biographies. There's lots of photographs of this dog all over the place with Picasso. And it is peculiar because you can actually look at Hammersley's contact sheets at the Smithsonian Archives and look at the contact sheets from this period. There are no photographs on the contact sheets of Picasso's studio. And this is what Picasso's studio looked like. You'd think that he would have taken one, but no, this is the only picture that he took. No Picasso, no art, a dog. And it's interesting, if you notice that dresser behind the dog, it appears in this photograph by Cartier-Bresson. And so you can see there the unmade bed and the unmade Picasso. standing in front of the same dresser that appears in Hammersley's photograph. Another studio that he visited was that of Constantin Brancusi. Picasso apparently didn't mind people taking photographs in his studio, and a lot of people did. Brancusi did mind. As you probably know, Brancusi was very interested in self-documenting and sort of controlled a bit the appearance of his work. But Hammersley managed to take this photograph and a couple others before Brancusi actually told him to stop. And this is memorialized in his diary, which you can also read online at the Smithsonian. Late in 1944, so again, this is just months after the liberation of Paris, the war is still going on in the East. Hamersley enrolls at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And I think it was the rationale from the Army's perspective, the Army paid for it, was that he was working essentially as a graphic designer in the Army, and this would help him to build up his skills. But he was drawing from the figure, I believe, at one, he was at the École des Beaux-Arts. This is a photograph he shot there of the courtyard with the wonderful, probably plaster statues. And then in 1945, he went to Berlin, very shortly after the defeat of the German army in Berlin. This is a photograph he took at Tempelhof Airport. And I'm showing this because it really illustrates the way in which, in these photographs, again, this is from 1945, you begin to see some of the essential compositional tropes that follow him throughout his career. In particular, the kind of bifurcated composition, the duality, in this case of light and dark. And you'll notice in the dark area there's a man, and in the light area there's a woman, so it's even binary by gender. And this kind of thing appears over and over and over again in his painting. And here you can see an example on the right, a piece called Me and Thee, which is in the show from 1980, which has precisely that kind of binary attitude. But then on the left, from 1984, a piece called Underwater, which is an example of his organic abstraction, where he really just lets loose and lets his intuition take over. And just a quick example of another extreme in his open-mindedness is this work, Bertha, from 1965, where he did an organic abstraction, then cut it up into 4 by 5, 20 pieces and reassembled them, maybe by chance, probably by chance, so that's how you get this grid composition. He was very open to new things, and in 1968 he moved to Albuquerque and began to experiment with computer drawing. He worked with an IBM computer at the university and learned how to make compositions with the computer and just the marks just made by kind of the available characters on the typewriter. That type of thing. It wasn't exact typewriter, obviously, but anyway, there you see. And I think we'll hear more about those later. And then throughout all of this, he's making drawings, these really quite remarkable figure drawings. Some, like the one on the left, show maybe some of the chops he got at the École des Beaux-Arts. There's a sort of a residue of classical figure drawing in there. And then on the right, just strange Frederick Hammersley, indescribable, what the heck. That's all I have to say. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce Elaine Yau, who received her PhD from UC Berkeley's Department of Art History in 2015 with a specialization in modern and contemporary art as it intersects with vernacular culture, African American art history, and American material and visual culture. Beyond her essay in this catalog, she is also the author of forthcoming essays on Sister Gertrude Morgan's performance and painting in the 1960s and on the shifting position of folk art in African American art. So, Elaine, thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Larry, and thank you to everybody for coming this afternoon and to our speakers as well for their expertise and their time. Let me give you a quick outline of today's program before I go ahead and introduce our speakers. Each one will be speaking for about 15 minutes. We'll have a moderated panel discussion, and then following, we welcome the audience's questions and comments as well. So our first speaker today is James Glisson. He is the interim Virginia Steele Scott Chief Curator of American Art at the Huntington Library, Art Collections, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. With Alan Phoenix, scientist emeritus at the Getty Conservation Institute, James co-curated Frederick Hammersley to Paint Without Thinking, a 2017 exhibition that traveled to the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. His writings have appeared in Art Forum, Panorama, After Image, CAA Reviews, and his exhibitions have been covered by the LA Times, El País, and Hyperallergic, among many others. In his talk today, James will explore the gray area between spontaneity and control in which Hammersley so fruitfully worked for over 60 years. Next, we'll have Joe Traugott. Joe Traugott is an independent curator, writer, and member of the board of directors of the Frederick Hammersley Foundation. In 2013, he retired after a 30-year career as a curator of 20th century art at the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe, where he organized numerous exhibitions, including, most relevant for us today, Visual Puns and Hard Edge Poems, works by Frederick Hammersley in 2000. He is the author of many books on art and material culture, such as Buried Cars, Excavations from Stonehenge to the Grand Canyon, with photographer Patrick Nagatani, and New Mexico Art Through Time, Prehistory to the Present, which traces 13,000 years of art making in the American Southwest. Joe's talk will frame Hammersley's dual approaches to art in terms of a fusion of science and humor. Our third speaker is Leslie Jones, curator of prints and drawings from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where she has curated exhibitions including The Serial Impulse at Gemini GEL, 2016, and John Baldessari, Pure Beauty, in 2010. She regularly writes on the subject of modern and contemporary prints and drawings, and her most recent publication is The Personal is Computable, Sonia Rappaport, which appears in the January 2019 issue of Art in Print. An essay on the prints of Julie Moretu will be in the upcoming LACMA exhibition catalog this fall, and visitors can also make plans for 2021 to visit the exhibition that Leslie is currently organizing, and that is entitled Coded, Art at the Dawn of the Computer Age, 1960 to 1980. And it is in the context of this project that Leslie will speak to us today about Hammersley's computer drawings. And finally, David Pagel is an art critic who writes regularly for the New York Times, and he is also professor of art history and theory at Claremont Graduate University, where he also serves as chair of the art department. In addition, David is an adjunct curator at the Parrish Art Museum in Watermill, New York, where he has organized exhibitions such as Underground Pop and Damaged Romanticism, a mirror of modern emotion, to name just a few. An avid cyclist, he is also a 6-time winner of the California Triple Crown. David's presentation will take us through what he calls the efficiency and mystery of Hammersley's organic abstractions. Please join me in welcoming all of our speakers today.
So thank you, Elaine, for that introduction. And I just want to say, I think that the exhibit is great. So congratulations to you and Larry. I did the supremely annoying thing for a speaker, and I've decided to do something that's kind of different than what I said I was going to do. But what I was working on was reminding me of being in graduate school, and that seemed like a sign that I didn't need to do it. So moving on. One of the dangers in working on Frederick Hammersley is that the archive is too big, the words too many, the painting notebooks too complete. Like Borges' Library of Babel, Hammersley can become a closed system of processes and notebooks in which everything refers to everything else. That completeness is part of the elegance, but at least for today, I'm going to really try to break out of that mold. So I'm sharing some miscellany, some thoughts that occurred to me about him over the years. They're not meant to add up to an overall theory of Hammersley, but they are meant to open up avenues for kind of possible interpretations and to sort of break through this completeness. First, so number one, Hammersley and op art. The zing, the wham, the pow, or the visual torque that's induced by strong colors and bold compositions that you see in his paintings, wherein shapes pull away from the canvas and they twist. Seesaw, for example, up there on the screen, at least in person, not so much up on the screen, visually flips back and forth. First, the black diamonds in the center assert themselves, then they recede as the squares in the corner jump forward. Boom, boom. With only two colors and two sets of four congruent squares set at 485-degree angles to each other, Seesaw has the laconic austerity of a Euclidean geometric construction, yet the toggling of the sets of squares makes it into a kinetic illusion, which the work's title references. Another painting with equally eye-twisting powers is Couplet, a Venn diagram of sorts in which black and white overlap in the center, and the center becomes a kind of eye-shaped blue void. White swings forward, black swings forward, the cerulean at the center elbows its way in, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. Interestingly enough, Hammersley fit enough into the aesthetic of op art in the 1960s to have been included in the landmark show by William Seitz in 1964 called The Responsive Eye. Hammersley sent this painting, this is the best image the foundation can find of it, to that exhibition. It's called That. And it's from 1964. And I want to show you Mike Wallace. So if I could cue the video, please.
The Responsive Eye is the title of an exhibition on view at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City between February 23rd and April 25th, 1965. Who owns the Responsive Eye? You do. If there is one thing more than any other that we like to assume about a work of art, it's that it will sit still and behave itself while we take a look at what the artist has created. But now a whole...
Great. Okay, thank you. Now, my takeaway from this is not that Mike Wallace is an undiscovered art critic of the 1960s, just waiting for an intrepid graduate student to crank out a dissertation on him. No, not that, but you really should watch the rest of the film. And Hammersley's painting does eventually make an appearance. No, this film offers a bit of evidence that this kind of art was fun. Or it was at least lighthearted, and it was delightfully dizzying. The woman going like this, slightly inebriated, really gets at that. These art objects elicit zany responses from people, and the way this film's edited hams that up. And I think it's a good interesting historical document. But it also shows, and here's how I'm gonna get Hammersley out of his bubble in Albuquerque. It also shows that the playfulness of Hammersley's titles, Love Me, Love My Dog, that's my favorite, You're Just Like Your Mother, Power Steering, Mutual Fund, Cool de Sac, and Tour de Fourth, kind of bad, he likes bad puns, they start to seem a little bit less idiosyncratic and a little bit more in line with the bigger cultural vibe around art, op art at the moment. So that's kind of thought bubble number one. Thought bubble number two. Hammersley and his relation to John McLaughlin and Agnes Martin. So John McLaughlin's paintings have an austere symmetry to them, and they generally don't lift off the canvas or dance around. They sit still. McLaughlin and Hammersley knew each other. They were in a show together, most famously the LACMA show of 1959 for abstracts classicists that brought Hammersley to widespread acclaim. They're often mentioned together and even shown together to this day, though I think their aims could not be more opposed. McLaughlin wanted paintings to be object lessons in nothingness, points of focus to call attention to an inner emptiness. They are things of the world, but meant as act as stepladders to the otherworldly. This is how McLaughlin puts it. I believe that forms other than rectangles assume a kind of entity and, in a sense, become objects and therefore misleading. By the use of the rectangle in concert with relatively large empty areas, I strive to create a feeling of anonymity in terms of the total canvas. In another context, McLaughlin called his desired effect the, quote, marvelous void. The austerity of John McLaughlin just simply isn't there in Hamersley. I mean, we can debate that later. Neither is if people disagree, we can debate that later. Neither is the rigorous refusal that McLaughlin had to bat away the merest suggestion of the hint of a subject. So McLaughlin uses titles to shut down associations. He has titles, numerical titles, like Untitled, common title. V, 1957. Number 5, number 1962. Hamersley, as many of us in the audience know, did use a numbering system, but he almost always attached a very witty verbal title that he put a lot of effort into making, and therefore his abstractions are meant to have some sort of cloud, however nebulous, of associations around it. If McLaughlin, there's a few other McLaughlins, also kind of resolutely flat. If McLaughlin is a historically obvious point of intersection, I think Agnes Martin is probably much less so. She's mostly not a colorist, though there are moments. And as far as I know, and I wish Kathleen were here, but other people from the foundation can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm under the impression Hamersley just wasn't in dialogue with Agnes Martin's work. Remember, Kathleen and I have discussed that at some point. Nonetheless, I came across her near but not quite grid piece of 1963, which is up on the screen. It's called Leaf in the Wind. Came across it recently, and it got me thinking about Hamersley. Like Hamersley, it does an optical dance. It's probably exceptionally hard to see on this PowerPoint. But if you see it in person, the eyes try to line up these various squares and elements to pull them back into shape, only to have them pop back out again. It's a bit like tamping on a deck of cards to make them all neat and even out, only to have one card kind of slide out, and then have to do it all over again. Leaf in the Wind, as she titled it, I think has a mimetic component, though one that is pressed through an alembic and then kind of triple distilled. The backing and forthing of a leaf, and I'm going to take a little liberties here. I see this as this movement of your eye is a kind of parallel with the backing and forthing of a leaf. Not a leaf on a sidewalk, not a leaf caught on a gutter, but foliage as attached to a branch that's yielding to the breeze, and the leaf itself kind of fluttering and going back and forth within a relatively small area of motion. So it's this picture is so far from a real tree in the breeze. It's sort of like a sinusoidal curve of movement of some natural phenomenon, taking the totality of the movements without ever expressing or instantiating any actual movement that really happened. Put another way, it's like a total set of data that obscures any distinct bits of actual observation. This brings me to, and I'll bring it back to Hamersley in a minute, this brings me to Agnes Martin's series On a Clear Day, a group of 30 screen prints by Martin from between 1967 and 1974. Leaf in the Wind with that title feels a bit literal out when you start looking at these. And yet maybe there's something here in these prints about the hint of a horizon, and less specifically the division of the visual field. That is, vision itself is a whole, like the surface of the paper, but always demarcated by sensations, by colors, by objects, in the same way that the lines are traced on the paper. So you have the visual field and then objects in it, is a kind of a metaphor for the piece of paper with the lines across it. But the title, again, does an awful lot of work for Martin. It references the sky on a cloudless day. The line above the horizon, the line of the horizon, then back to the line, then we go back to the lines on the paper, right? Those are kind of the circle of associations. Here again is the merest essence of the visual experience of a landscape, a whiff, like the smell of a flower or the ocean caught in the breeze, there and then gone again. Martin beautifully summarized this dynamic between the observed and the abstract in a quote that I just love, and I'm sure some of you know it. Martin writes, "Classicists are people that look out with their back to the world." Let me say that again. Classicists are people that look out with their back to the world. This reminded me of anecdotes I'd heard about Frederick Hammersley, whom I did not know. I never met him, from both Arden Reed and Kathleen Shields and Elizabeth East, and probably some others at this point, about his nearly constant patter about the visual world, about what he saw, how he felt, the emotions that he attached to sensations, which I understand could sometimes be really intense, and that he was constantly sort of feeling and verbalizing. The paintings, though, with their precision and restraint, seem to turn their backs on the world, on all of this, to have simplified it, to contain it. He turned his back from the emotional and the visual clutter of the world to make these paintings. So he's a kind of he's, to me, a perfect classicist in Agnes Martin's sense. Okay. Did I not? I didn't have the right slides up. Sorry about that. This is, pardon me, this is On a Clear Day. Okay. This could, I think Elaine Yau and Larry Rinder's decision to include the Northridge photographs was really important. I was so delighted to see that they're on display. This is because unlike the abstract paintings in which he is a classicist looking out with his back to the world, these photographs document Hamersley looking out to the world, face forward, and keeping a record of it all. So we've got these two examples up here on the screen. I realize what I'm saying kind of assumes an equivalence between lived vision and photography, the idea that the way we see and the way we photograph are kind of one and the same. But I think that Hamersley kind of actually says that in the very interesting essay that was also published in the catalog. Vision, he seems to equate with photography. He writes, "People as a rule do not look long. They seldom look beyond identifying the object before them. For him, this is sloppy vision, which then yields sloppy photography. Thoughtful looking is like the great photograph that gets an object, a scene, or a landscape from a single frame, even though we know to really encompass something requires multiple frames." So maybe actually I should rephrase that and say that lived vision and photography actually parallel each other. My last point is about glands. Not those glands. Frederick Hammersley liked to talk about glands, by which he meant intuition. The photography essay allows me to talk about this last observation. Frederick Hammersley's sensitivities to the workings of the human mind, the vast shadow that hangs over its operations, and the logic and the knowledge that logic and thought really only occupy a rather small part of what goes on in our brains. The photography essay towards the end talks about glands, one of Hammersley's funny phrases for intuition, and the neither reaches of the mind. In the photography essay, Frederick writes, quote, "One of the advantages of slowing down and wondering and thinking is that one finds out that thinking is not the answer. It is the painting that contains the solution. The body, the glands, seem to know more than the mind, and the feelings are generally ahead of the mind." Were he around today, I'm sure Hamersley would have read the popular literature on neuroscience. He would have seen lots of evidence for his experimental, and he would have seen all sorts of evidence for his experiential knowledge about his own mental processes. But I don't quite need that, because I know for a fact that Hamersley read William James's Talks to Teachers, book about pedagogy. The book was published in 1899, but it went through lots and lots of editions, and it reworks the portions of William James's The Psychology, which is James's lengthy and technical magnum opus, and it does it into a kind of accessible form. In light of the burgeoning fields of psychology and neurology, James realized that every moment of our lives happens due to the firing of neurons. Indeed, our emotions, memories, sensations are neurochemical reactions, and that nearly all of the brain's activities happen without us being aware. In Hamersley's copy of Talks to Teachers, Hamersley's underlining and marginal notations are mostly in James's chapters on habit, activities he considers under the excuse me, I lost my place. Let me start that sentence again. In Hamersley's copy of Talks to Teachers, Hamersley's underlining and marginal notations are mostly in the chapter on habit, activities that James considers under the minimal to no control of a conscious agent. 99/100ths, or possibly 999 10,000ths of our activity is purely automatic and habitual, from, James says, from our rising in the morning to our laying down at night, our dressing and undressing, our eating and drinking, our greetings and partings, our hat raisings, etc., etc. For James, we are generally at a remove for ourselves, our actions enveloped in twilight. And another passage, James says practice enough and a difficult task can be accomplished, quote, without hardly any consciousness at all, close quote. It's as if we're reading Hamersley here, because the brain has been folded, that's James's word, by repeated activity. Hamersley underlined the sentence I just read. Unlike breathing or other involuntary processes, habits are acquired for better or for worse, and as an artist who'd gone through arduous studio training, Hamersley knew that practice could make drawing, color mixing, and painting easier and fluid. Indeed, his repetition year after year, decade after decade of the free association process he used for generating titles was an exercise to train himself, to limber up, to spew words, to pour it out literally, and not hold back. James and Hamersley recognized that habits were as much about constriction as they were about dilation and focus. Spontaneity must be practiced. And I'm about to wrap it up. Another passage that Hamersley underlines in Talks to Teachers concerns solving a problem by doing another task, as if, without actually focusing on the task, a solution will appear. So this is what William James writes, and this is what Frederick Hammersley underscores in his copy of this book. Some of the most efficient workers I know are the ultra-scatterbrain type. Guilty. One friend who does a prodigious quantity of work has in fact confessed to me that if he wants to get ideas on any subject, he sits down to work on something else. His best results come from his mind wandering. For James, this is not about divine inspiration and an idea implanted by a higher power. Rather, the anecdote is proof that the mind gnaws away at problems on many levels. Some of these are brightly illuminated by the thinker's full attention, while others are dimly lit, chaotic spaces in which ideas flicker like fireflies. Hamersley found in James a writer who anatomized with sharp prose the thought processes and churning quality of our inner mental lives, a writer who gave substance and form to the artist Hamersley's intuitions about thinking and making, or, well, to put it more succinctly, William James understood glands. Thank you so much.
Do we have the first slide?
Let me help you. I think we have to just cue this up.
Well, before I start, I want to thank Larry and Sherry and Elaine for getting all of us together this afternoon and for putting together such a great exhibition. And I express my sadness that Kathleen's flight from Albuquerque to the Bay Area was canceled last night, and she's no longer here, which is a shame. My talk is about a good line is hard to beat. That is my favorite Hammersley title, and it sums up a lot of my thoughts about his work. The thesis of today's talk is sort of 4 parts. The first is that Hammersley's art evolved from a rather version of academic realism that he learned in school and made the transition to modernism through a kind of scientific methodology. And second, he alternated his practice between science-like explorations and periods of free-ranging abstraction. And in New Mexico, Hamersley began framing his works using an aesthetic that contradicted the conventional modernist aesthetic. And last, I want to put Hamersley's work in another frame to give you a sense of where his reputation is developing. Hamersley was really quite talented as a realist painter from his art school days. And after he was drafted into the army and saw modernism in France, when he returned after the war, he vowed to learn how to make modernist art. And to do so, he started off with an abstraction of an idea, a still life that was painted with only 4 colors, red, yellow, black, and white, and it's a realist painting. 4 versions later, we get a very different version of this image. And you see how in 4 paintings over a little over a year, Hamersley could master step-by-step simplification and the flattening of form, the exact opposite of what he was taught to do in art school. And after that, he began a whole series of small lithographs that taught him the rudiments of abstract theory in terms of the imagery. He used 2 theories. One was a repetition of 4 squares in 16 square layouts. The other was a vision that realized that you needed 1 white and 1 black square within the 16, and that you could split the others between light gray and dark gray and create compositions that were abstract, scientific, and very powerful. When Hamersley began using different forms of marking and then printed those small lithographs on magazine illustrations, you get the image that you see now. It brings together both Hamersley's vision of abstraction and his continual interest in photography and in life drawing. These 2 series were really about scientific explorations of visual phenomena. But after that, he started a period of freewheeling abstraction. And this is the first of his, quote, hunch paintings. The hunches were very much about his individualized response to marks that he already made. But what is so important about these is that his inspiration was based on the scientific information that he learned from the large series of lithographs. And over the next few years, the paintings and drawings that he did defined his sense of the hunch. The drawings were in fact quite small compared to the paintings, which symbolized the hard edge painting that he is well known for. But these were hunches. Made a line. What was the next line? What was the next color? Same thing with the flat areas of paint that he put on canvas. Again, this is the reverse of his scientific approach to art making. The geometric series, there were two of them, one from 59 to 68 and the other from the early 70s to the 90s, presented hard edge versions, again, of now a 9-square tic-tac-toe pattern. And what is so powerful about these images is that they were also devised from his scientific and regularized production. He started with little sketches, and as he finalized a design, he painted it in a painting notebook. The notebooks were painted in oils. The edges are pristine. But what happens to the paper and the oil is that they bleed together, and you have the reversal on the left-hand side and the next set of paintings on the right. And what is so powerful is this sense of the abstraction of Hamersley's abstraction that you see in his painting notebooks. Hamersley was notorious for his careful documentation of the materials that he used, the time when he did it, when he started, when he finished. These are fascinating bits of information. And during the whole time that I had worked with Hamersley, which was almost 25 years, he never told me about the documentation. The only information I knew about was the painting notebooks, and the next piece of information, the title pages. Hammersley would mark down a freewheeling sense of ideas, and I reproduce some of these: stock market, bargain, standing room, risk, task, freestanding associations that he then would line up with one of his paintings. And there was a clear relationship between the dualities of the words that he put together for his titles and the images themselves, what the images looked like they were doing. When he got to New Mexico, he was actually in a quandary and really didn't work for a few months, and then began making the computer drawings. And the computer drawings were another sense of his very systematic, scientific approach. Now, you and I can go home this afternoon and make a Hamersley computer drawing on your PC, and it will take you about 20 minutes. On the other hand, Hamersley used punch cards and would spend the better part of a week doing an image, and then would print it out, and if there were errors, he had to go home and figure out which card was mispunched, repunch it, and then print out the correct answer to the problem. After basically a year and a half of making computer drawings, he tired of that and went back to making the geometric paintings. But in this case, the paintings became generally much smaller, and all of his work became small and focused during this period. As he tired of making the geometric paintings, he worked on another series of hunches. In this case, the hunch paintings were organic images that brought together strange color or transformations from one color to blends from one color to the next, and forms that seemed to interlock as if they were spirals. What's interesting about the organic paintings is their relationship to both life drawing and his photographs of human beings. And so you begin to see the relationship between photography and drawing as source material and the color paintings that were put together as hunches that didn't start with a fixed idea, but evolved very, very slowly. Hammersley left about a dozen paintings that were incomplete in the studio. And as he would work on the organic paintings, he would turn them back to the wall. So he wouldn't look at them until he was ready to look at them seriously. And then he would turn them forward so you could see. And he would make the next move and turn the paintings away again. Along with the organic paintings, he began framing his works in these very strange frames. It's hard to decide whether these frames are folk art or whether they're outsider art or a blending of the two ideas. But the main thing is that they are the antithesis visually of the work that he was making. And what was so interesting about these frames is that he liked them so much that he went back and started reframing 40 years of art with the new series of frames. And so you have examples where he would frame the 3-inch square lithographs from 1949 in frames that he was doing at the end of his life. And what's so interesting about these frames is to see them in the context of the contemporary work. And so you cannot imagine a frame being any more opposite of the kind of freewheeling spirit that he had in the paintings. These are controlled, they are strange, and they are quirky. Another example. If you look closely, you'll see that one of the things that Hammersley did was to patina these frames. He would texture them with nails. He would then squeeze in paint and rub it away, add other textures to the paint, and then frame it. And the shift between the kind of image that he was making and the patinaed outsider frames is really a marvel. The fact that these are such powerful joint images is really to Hammersley's credit, that he was able to take ideas that are so diverse and so antithetical and make them whole. So how do we think about Hammersley's art in a larger sense? We can look at this painting, which is in the exhibition, and it is a real jewel. It is tiny. It is perfectly framed in one of his handmade frames, but not the folk art style. The painting is really interesting for a number of reasons. The first is that these paintings exemplified isomeric design. Isomeric design comes from chemistry, where you have two chemicals that have the same chemical composition, but in space, in three-dimensional space, the components are composed in a different arrangement. So how do you look at Hammersley's work in the broader sense? Well, these are about dualities. And so if we look at this painting, we can see that there's a duality between the black triangles and the white triangles, but there's more going on than that. One thing that's happening is that Hamersley is playing with figure-ground ambiguity. If you look at this painting, in theory, the white triangle should be in front of all the other parts of the picture, and the black triangle should be the most far away in terms of optical illusion. But Hamersley has controlled the tone and the pigment and the hue to such a degree that you can see these three components as being equals. So the center purple form can be seen as a ground, but it can also be seen as the figure. The black can be seen as a ground or as a figure. The white can be seen as the figure or the ground. And as we look at these paintings, we flip back and forth between these areas and perceiving them spatially as unclear versions of space. One of the things that Hammersley does with his imagery that makes this so powerful is he plays with border contrast phenomena. Border contrast phenomena describes the relationship between an edge. When you have a light form and a dark form forming an edge, at that particular juncture, the dark side looks a little lighter and the light side looks a little darker. It's a very subtle optical phenomena, but it is one of the things that empowers Hammersley's imagery to such a degree. And of course, we've all dealt with figure and ground relationships in terms of Rubin diagrams, which is the fancy name for the kind of versions that we had in the 3rd grade of a pair of faces or a goblet. And one of the reasons that that particular optical illusion is so powerful is that we understand what those forms really are. And if you take a Rubin diagram and turn it on its side or turn it upside down, it doesn't work, and you don't get the flipping back and forth between space. This sense of figure-ground ambiguity also exists in Pueblo pottery in the Southwest, and Hammersley was clearly aware of this phenomena. And if we see his painting next to the image of the Pueblo design, it is sort of the same. So we think of painted images on pottery as being black on white design, but when you have 50% of light and dark, what you end up with is ambiguity. And so as you see in the left image, it is both a black on white image, but it is also optically a white on black image. And that sense of ambiguity is something that Hammersley saw in Pueblo design. So how do we think of Hammersley? Well, Hammersley, to me, is a series of paradigm shifts. Paradigm was the term that Thomas S. Kuhn devised in the structure of scientific revolutions. And he came to this position because he realized that scientists were changing the basic understanding before they were able to prove their understanding with science. And so if we take paradigm, which has become a very popular term today, and think about Hammersley, I think of two really important things that Hammersley did. First, Hammersley made a paradigm shift with hard edge painting, which was not what you were taught to do in art school. And secondly, he made an even more important paradigm shift by making really interesting abstract art using typewriter characters in a computer. Two examples of Hamersley making a paradigm shift. And if we look at Hamersley's hard edge paintings as a category, we can see them as prime objects of cultural change. It was George Kubler who talked about prime objects and replications. Throughout Hamersley's career, he made paradigm shifts that are really prime objects of cultural change and took each of those ideas to their conclusion before he shifted into another version of himself. So to summarize, Hammersley was both a punster and a freewheeling modernist. Hammersley was a very serious artist invoking scientific methodology to help him achieve a modernist version of himself. And finally, Hammersley was always perfectly dressed. When he would go to an exhibition, he was always dressed to the nines, and as a painting or a drawing or a photograph would leave his studio, that work of art was equally well dressed and framed. And so that is a short version of Hammersley's art. He was one of the most challenging artists to deal with at the time, and now, a few years later, we see the power of his work as a whole.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. If you want to get up and stretch, that's okay. Sort of oh, yes, I do. Thank you. And while you're up here doing that, I'll just also extend my thanks to Elaine and to Larry and to Sherry and everyone here at BAMFA for inviting me to participate today. I'm very honored to be in such good company, my fellow panelists, who are all Hammersley experts, and I'm aspiring to be in a certain aspect of his work.
I seem to have lost the mouse.
Oh, this? No. Oh, we've lost the mouse.
We've lost the mouse.
It's on the screen. The mouse is on the screen.
Oh, here we go.
I'd also just to say how great it is to see the computer drawings so prominently displayed in the exhibition here, because I think up until very recently they were virtually unknown. So it's great to see them in all their glory, and hopefully I will give you some insight into them today. First, just a few words about the medium of drawing in general, which is very close to my heart. Drawing is a medium of aimless exploration. It is open-ended and meandering, playful and non-committal, like a doodle. Drawing is also a medium of observation and study from the physical world, as in a life drawing. And finally, drawing is a medium of analysis that can precisely encapsulate a form or idea, like a diagram. Frederick Hammersley practiced aimless, or we could also call it automatic drawing, like that on the left here, and life drawing from nude or portraiture, often of himself, like the two examples on the right, throughout his life. These are early examples from the 1950s up to 1960. And here are a few from later in his career, just so you can get a sense of how he did practice these different modes of drawing throughout. More automatic on the left and more the traditional life drawing on the right. These forms of drawing were habitual, even during his hard-edged geometric periods, and allowed Hammersley to draw in the moment, to explore variations of line quality and expressivity with diverse mediums without thinking, just making, just looking and making. Less regularly, but at key moments of transition in his career, Hammersley would use drawing as an analytical tool that allowed him, by contrast, to think to the max. Examples from one such transitional moment, and the subject of my talk today, are the computer drawings of 1969. Here are two examples, Tiddlywinks on the left and Buckboard on the right, both from 1969. In 1968, after more than 20 years working and teaching in Los Angeles, Hammersley moved to Albuquerque for a teaching position at the University of New Mexico. The move coincided with a hiatus in his painting activity, which may have made him more open to an invitation to join a class devoted to Art 1, one of the earliest computer programs designed for artists. Developed by University of New Mexico engineer Richard Williams in consultation with artist Catherine Nash, Art 1 allowed artists to create simple shapes, such as rectangles, circles, lines, and ellipses, composed of letters, numbers, and punctuation marks, the strokes of a keyboard, in other words. Here is a drawing that employs all the possible marks or keys available with the university's Impact printer. I think you can make out here, you'll see all the alphanumeric characters, basically starting with the alphabet on the outside, then with the punctuation marks, and at the very interior you have the numbers. Hammersley titled it Thought Holders, which suggests potentiality, possibility, and it appears as the first page of a set of drawings that I will return to in a moment. The working area or grid of each computer drawing measured 50 characters high by 105 characters wide, and the program allowed for 2 arrays, which meant the printer could double or overstrike, creating darker or denser marks. Here's an example of Hammersley's use of 2 arrays in which a dash overlaps the letter I to create the middle tone. Hopefully you can make that out in the detail on the right. And the letters I and H overlap to create the darker tone. Basically, the double strikes could be used as a means of shading, to use artistic terminology. The mainframe computer in use at the University of New Mexico was an IBM 360/40, and the printer an IBM 1403. The 360-40 was described as a mid-range model that was in use from 1965 to 1977 and configured for up to 256K of core memory. Imagine that. That was the maximum, okay? You could start with 16K if you were on the lower end. The execution of the drawings involved multiple steps. After initializing the Art 1 program, Hammersley typed in the numerical code corresponding to the desired figures, 02 for a line or 06 for an ellipse, for example. The computer would then generate a punch card that the artist handed off to an attendant behind a door, and in a few minutes, a drawing would appear. For Hammersley, the computer offered, in his words, seemingly endless and wonderful possibilities. This is an installation of 24 computer drawings, but over the course of a year, he made approximately 400 distinct images or compositions for a total of 1,200 computer drawings that included dupes or duplicates, variations, complete sets, and incomplete sets. At LACMA, we have 4 variations and one of only 5 complete sets of 72 computer drawings. LACMA's set is loosely bound with a string, as you see here on the left, which is very convenient because it makes it easily unbindable for display. And on the right is just an installation shot from 2006 of all 72 computer drawings installed together at Charlotte Jackson Fine Art in Santa Fe. The book format suggests a sequential reading, but there is no clear story. Believe me, I've gone through this many, many times. Or I'm just not getting it. Anyway, the only thing that is clear is that because the drawings are clearly dated, they are not in chronological order, but rather in order devised by Hammersley after the fact. That said, there is a certain sense of logic. For the most part, like drawings are grouped together, so you can see multiple variations, one after another. In order as they appear in the set, here are 5 drawings using only the apostrophe and the period as marks. This is astigmatism. The lion is busy. Astigmatism by degrees. Yo-yo. And yo-yo almost. And here, just to give you a few more examples, are 3 together that play with the target motif. You have to, speaking of op art, James, you have to let your eyes relax. You see the target. First, in this example, using only apostrophes and periods, eye of the bull. Then adding the letter U in the middle is the title. And here adding the letter G. G and the bull is the title. It seems that Hammersley wants the reader and viewer to understand his thought process and how he employed the strokes of the keyboard to draw. This would-be Art 1 drawing primer does not take itself too seriously, however. The titles often riff on the alphanumeric characters used in the drawing, as in G and the bull, which uses the letter G here. Or as another example, T-Talk, which uses the letter T overlapped with other various characters to create a sort of conversation. And in addition, between groups of like drawings, Hammersley occasionally interjected an apparent outlier or non sequitur. 2 such examples are scalloped potatoes on the left and clairol on the right, for which there are no other variations within the set. Hammersley seemed to go out of his way to disrupt a clear or logical and systematic reading, and he does so with a sense of humor. While whimsy certainly characterizes aspects of his work in other media as well, here it may have served also to humanize drawings perceived to be generated by a machine. As Elaine Yau has pointed out in her catalog essay, Hammersley leavens the technical process with humor. Although designed for artists, Art 1 was not used by many, and certainly not as well or exhaustively as it was by Frederick Hammersley. Here are examples of computer drawings by the 2 people who were involved in the development of Art 1. On the left, a work by Catherine Nash, and on the right, a work by Richard Williams, and a shout out to Patrick Frank in the audience for providing these images. He is, by the way, the expert on Art 1. It's not me, he is. Thank you, Patrick. As you can see, these works are more pictorial in nature. They suggest landscapes, whereas Hammersley's approach was all over. He consistently used the entire field, just as he did with his geometric and grid-based paintings. In terms of context, it's important to point out that Art 1 was just one of several programs developed at the time using the Fortran programming language. Here, for example, are works by other artists making computer drawings at the same time and using programs written in Fortran. On the left is a work by Vera Molnar, a Hungarian-born artist based in Paris, still going strong in her mid-90s. On the right, a work by Manfred Mohr, German artist, but now has been based in New York for many years. A couple more examples, a work by Colette Bangert, who's based in Kansas, and a work by Edward Sajic. In all these works, the image was generated using a plotter printer rather than an impact printer. By and large, plotters were used more frequently to make computer drawings, most likely because of their capacity to actually make lines. This is a slide of the artist Manfred Mohr, whose work we just saw setting up his plotter printer. I can't help but wonder what a plotter drawing by Hammersley would have looked like, but my sense is the greater range of graphic possibilities offered by a plotter wouldn't have appealed to his love of limits. There are few artists who have worked so creatively, and dare I say, joyfully, within formal confines. This is another example from the set called Jelly Centers. And really, what's not joyful about jelly centers, right? The computer drawings were but a brief episode, lasting only a year, but it was all immersive. And as has been pointed out by many others, it launched the artist into the most productive decade of his career. This is an installation shot from a 2017 exhibition at LA Louvre, showing the computer drawings on the right, you can see, with two paintings from the 1970s, which followed after the computer drawings. While clearly important to Hammersley's personal artistic development, the computer drawings are also important to the larger history of art and technology of the late 1960s. He was one of many artists exploring the creative possibilities of the computer, along with those making drawings, a few of whom I've already shown you, and others, like Stan Vanderbeek, shown here, working in other mediums, in his case, film. Opening the art historical lens still further, the computer drawings should also be considered within the mainstream discourses of the day, namely conceptual and minimal art. While Solowit, whose work I'm showing here, never used a computer, as far as I know, at least not to make art, he employed a loosely algorithmic approach to generate his series of incomplete open cubes. You may be familiar with this work because it's in the SF Moments collection on the left. Systems were definitely in the air, and the role of the computer and artists working with computers, even if briefly, provides an interesting perspective on art made in this period. And this, my dear friends, is a shameless plug for my exhibition, Coded, Art at the Dawn of the Computer Age, which would go into more depth about bringing these artists like Hamersley and others working with computers directly, or at least thinking like computers. So with that, I'll leave you hanging until 2021.
So first, I want to thank Larry and Elaine for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be on this panel of these group of people who I think of as Hamersley experts. I don't think of myself as a Hamersley expert in any way, shape, or form. I think of myself as a Hamersley fan. I love everything he's left us. I do, just sitting here listening to the first three talks, or the first four actually, I can't help but think that Hamersley would have been really happy to see this go on, because I think he worked across many media and approaches and styles, each one really intensely, but with all kinds of different things going on. And I think that now he's working on us in the same way, or we're kind of doing the same thing to his body of work that he did to those materials. Like each of the 4 or 5 of us come at it with our certain angle and take different things out, and there's really nifty overlaps. But I also feel it's always open and suggestive, and you feel these really neat parallels. Like when someone shows something, like, oh, I never thought of it in terms of that, but it makes perfect sense. And I really feel that that's what Hamersley is all about. It isn't about nailing things down. It's always about suggesting things and possibility and opening things up. I think of him as one of the most generous artists who I've ever looked at. So my talk is going to be on the organics, which I'm thankful that other people didn't talk too much about, so I have something hopefully new to say. And to me, it's really interesting that there's 2 moments in Hamersley's life where he turned to the organics. One was from 63 to 65, when he had reached kind of a dead end in his painting, and he was kind of stuck. I don't think he had a painter's block, but I think he was just like wasn't moving on because he didn't feel it was he was getting a lot out of it, or there wasn't a point in doing it. And he went back to his organics and really kind of rejuvenated himself. Another time he went and he did it for a couple of years and then stopped. So it was just from 63 to 65. He made his organics and his cut-ups. 40 organics, 16 cut-ups. The 16 cut-ups were made over a 1-week period in February of 63, and then a 1-month period the next year. And for the organics, he was stuck, and he thought, like, I'm going to make a painting a day, and he did that for 36 days. So it was this kind of like really getting back into it and finding kind of this connection between line and color. And then another time from 80 2 to 83, I think he made no paintings at all. And then he went back to the organics in 84, this time smaller, more intimate in those wacky frames. When he went back to them, then he actually never stopped and kept working with them for the rest of his life. And then even after he stopped making the geometrics, he continued on till the very, very end with his organics. So I'm going to show you one hunch, 4 cut-ups, 1 geometric, a bumper sticker, and a smattering of related eccentrics. This is the what's known as a hunch painting, and I think it's laid out really clearly. He was like, Fred would get the bare canvas, he'd make a move based on a hunch, and then he would sit and look at it, and then he would make another move based on a hunch and build the composition that way. I think that's a pretty radical way of going about it. I teach in art schools. What faculty in art schools in the country right now, the worst answer you could ever give us is, I did that because I felt like it, or I did that because it was a hunch, or that was an intuition. You'll basically be laughed out of the room and ridiculed. People in art schools want analysis and reasons. I happen to be a hunch lover. I think I don't think intuition is unsophisticated. I think actually our best intuitions are cultivated, and they're this marriage of kind of our animal lizard brain selves, or maybe even the microbes in our intestines, and our highest forms. And, and there's kind of a jumping off point for the organics. And the first 3 organics kind of show, this one to me is almost like a still life, where it's completely, almost a frame within a frame. He's like looking at maybe it's a bird's eye view of a still life, or I'm in a drone hovering over the table looking down at the still life. And then he gets a little closer. The edges start to fracture, start to open up, things spill off the edges. And then here, he's all the way in, and you're all the way in. And to me, that's like, his work really stands out for being kind of, I think of it as artisanal in practice, another thing that might not be thought of as sufficiently conceptual, but I do think that he cared about materials in a way that artisans and craftspeople usually do. And I also think the intimacy is a huge component of his work that makes him stand out. And this is just like bringing you right into the painting. Another organic, the colors getting intenser, more intense, sharper. And then a cut-up from 64. The first cut-ups he made, he actually cut up pieces that he had painted and then decided to destroy and reconstitute. I remember the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe how radical I thought that was. I've sawed some lumber at home making bookshelves and things, and it's pretty messy. In the way, I don't know how Fred cut this stuff up, but they're really, really clean edges. It's almost like a surgeon dissecting the patient and then putting it back together a la Frankenstein. And I think that it's so expresses this kind of non-preciousness of this stuff, a real deep concern for something that you really, really care about, and then you chop it up and put it back together. And I just think that that's a really, really extreme thing to do. They're on chipboard panels, so it involves a saw. I think he I don't know this, but I don't think he put them back together randomly. Well, maybe that one. Maybe this, to me, that seems like he's composing with the bits. But to me, it's a little bit like the hunches, where he'd put one piece down and then respond to it, and put another one down and respond to it. So it's like kind of like painting with painting, or actually like putting a puzzle back together with, or putting a jigsaw puzzle together, or different jigsaw puzzles together into one piece. This is then after the cut-ups, and I think that to go from that to the cut-ups, then it actually changes the way the organics look. And I think this one to me feels like made by a person who was looking at a composition that could be chopped up, computerified, or systematized and rearranged. A lot of the cut-ups are named after people, making me think in terms of portraiture rather than still life or landscape. Almost all are vertically oriented. Alice. And then after the cut-ups, these, I think the colors got more intense, and to me the edges got sharper. Each chunk of color seems to be more distinct from the other ones, where the earlier ones I showed there was more tonal, a smoother movement. And also in these coming right after the cut-ups, that grid goes away, and we get much more dramatic swoops and curls, like in those two guys. So to me, it's like he's both like doing something with one thing and then doing something else after that actually isn't that's getting as far away from it as possible. So that's the first chunk of the 60s cutouts. And so for a little gap in the middle, I wanted to show a piece by Jean Arp, which I think rhymes a lot with Hammersley's stuff. But I wanted to show that Arp in conjunction with a Warhol, two artists not usually put together. But to me, if the Arp shallow reliefs, painted shallow sculptural relief, in the Warhol grid painting had a Lovechild, it would be a Hamersley painting. To me, there's something Warhol always said, pop art is about liking things, but the only quote that people don't take seriously from Andy, and I think that actually it's one of the most important things he said. And he also said, I want to be a machine. And I think that part was like Warhol not wanting to have to suffer to make work, but just crank it out, and the result is what mattered, and then people would enjoy it. And I think that actually captures a lot of what Hammersley was up to, that I don't think he cared at all about people looking at the work and saying, oh, he must have suffered so to make this. I think it was, in a way, it's a really selfless art, or a grown-up art, where it's not about the artistic process and all that interiority. It's really about being public and well-dressed and impeccably put together when you go out there and you present your best face to the world. Underwater is one from '84. Yeah, so this one comes right after a 2-year period where he didn't paint at all. That's upstairs. Yeah, and the first time I saw these works in the frames, it was so radically out of place what was supposed to be around a painting like that. But to me, it worked just perfectly, and to me, it was the result of a real innovative, original, unafraid to do just what he wanted. And I always think of Hammersley's paintings as gifts, and I think of the frames as really like great wrappings for gifts in a way, and actually kind of protective things, like a pretty sturdy wood frame that can take a nick or a scruff to protect the work. This one's called Different Drummer, and I think that Hammersley was he marched to the beat of his own drum, probably to music that only he could hear. Bee's Knee, I love it because the expression is bee's knees. So when you give bee's knee, I think immediately, something's missing. The bee lost a limb. Yeah. And it feels like a tragedy and loss. And I think, Pagel, you're thinking the wrong way. That's just the expression that implies there's two of them or more than one of them. And what if Hammersley is just like making you zero in on one knee of one bee? And it's that kind of detail and precision and focus that I think is important. And for me, it's like every element of every piece matters a lot to Hammersley, and he wants you to look at that. Final word, which I'm happy to see in another slide behind Hammersley. To me, there are no final words when it comes to talking about Hammersley's work, because I think it's work that cannot be pinned down and summarized and analyzed and wrapped up and tidily put away. That there's always something more in his work. Steak and Ale, a beautiful combination of some of the ugliest colors one can imagine. New member, to me it's just like the thing's alive. But it's always these kind of, to me it's a lot like the geometrics where the parts kind of come together, but there's always more there than just those parts coming together. Scissors, with his name written really big right in the middle. And I think of this one as like a scissors is what you usually use to cut things up, but here he's like kind of broken the scissors apart to make more space for something else to happen. family tree. There's kind of a tree in there, but maybe not. Happenstance. Again, just like such a great way of the way he uses language to make it do something that it had been doing, but something also totally different. From going from happenstance is just an accident to spreading it out to hap and stance, where something kind of happens, and then you have to take a stand about it. Comes out of Eden, to me, is what all of his work does. That there's this kind of it's not the Garden of Eden. It's actually kind of better than the Garden of Eden because it came out of that and it did something more. But there's a sense of fall and recovery. Another art, I always think of the intimacy and the scale of Hammersley's work is rhyming with Ron Nagel's pieces, another kind of great miniaturist who cares a lot about materials and form. I think they pair real nice. And then the one geometric I have is this one to set up this one. Because I think that the graphic design element is a really important component of Hammersley art. And in terms of like that also in art schools, you're kind of, until very recently, you're not supposed to talk about that because that's commercial and it's selling stuff. And what you're doing as an artist supposedly is something above that or better than that or different from that. And I think that that's a really silly way of looking at things. And I think that a lot of the power of Fred's work is in the taking graphics and doing something artistic with them. So, 14 minutes and 33 seconds. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think we're on. Terrific. Thank you all so very much. My own wheels are sort of spinning in a wonderful way, and I'll just jump in and please, I'll address my questions to the group, so not everybody has to feel the pressure to respond. But I'd like to start on the topic of pleasure, and I think it piggybacks on David, your talk, but it also, I'm going to try to wind my way back to James, something that your talk raised for me, which is that issue of habits and the William James text. So Hammersley, as I've been researching and getting to know his art, often talked about feeling good, and that's a quotation, how he wouldn't start a mark or make a move until it felt good. And so I wanted to ask all of you, how do you think the sense of feeling good or pleasure relates to his intuitive, but also his methodical aspects? That is, how you might, as inscrutable as pleasure often can be, but how you might talk about that in relationship to the different bodies of work that you all have discussed today.
For me personally, pleasure is harder to come by the older I get. When I was a kid, it was really easy to get pleasure everywhere. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the kind of increasing sophistication or complexity of his work, that he always was seeking to please himself in what he was doing, and he couldn't do the same thing over and over and over because after a while it wasn't pleasurable. So to me, some of the pleasure in Hammersley is about discovery and the unforeseen and the unknown, and always something just over the horizon. So for me, it's a really an alive kind of activity that takes lots of habitual work and dedicated labor.
Hammersley always had a lot of work in his house, a lot of reproductions of everything from old master paintings to the present. And he would look at something that you would think he would not be interested in, and his comment was, "It's marvelous." And that really sums up the way he looked at the world and how he responded, not only to other things, but to the things things he was making.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the computer drawings, I mean, I think he marveled at the technology of what was possible, that so many, you could, you know, just so many variations were possible. And in a way, it played into his, I think, very efficient nature. I mean, it was a way to sort through so many different possible compositions and images, you know, at once by using the computer, you know, and an algorithmic way of thinking. But then, as you know, I think I made very clear in my talk, is that the humor and the joy came also in his titlings and his use of language, which is something that seems to kind of come out in all of our talks about, you know, and how big a part of his work titles were, really.
What comes to mind for me is the act of painting, particularly with the geometric. So all the planning he did was so that when he actually sat down, he just painted. You know, there wasn't much thinking to do. And the very beautiful surface of those paintings, which is created without brushes, he would just use palette knives to achieve those nice lines. And so there's something, at least for me, that I imagine him zoning out in his small house in Albuquerque and painting away. But that very visceral act of kind of being in the moment and being in the zone and just sort of doing it with not too much kind of cogitation going on.
Wonderful, thank you. My next question tries to expand a little bit on his methodical nature, the organization. I know, Joe, you touched on that, and that was a surprising fact for me, that in your 25-year relationship, he sort of kept part of his record keeping undisclosed. So if I could ask you, and for others too, how did that discovery change the way you understood his process? Did you ever have a sense that his record keeping was mostly for himself, or that he actually had a legacy beyond himself in mind with the way that he was documenting his practice?
Well, Hammersley had a couple aspects of his personality. One is very openness, and one is very careful and concealing aspect of his personality. And I think when he talked with other artists, he was very covetous of his material and didn't give information out and was not a teacher in that sense. That's very different than the other part of his personality, which was punning, humorous, open, the perfect gentleman in a public circumstance. That was two completely different parts of his personality.
So I got to know him, so to speak, through the records that were kind of news to people who knew him better. So I've only known him as a list maker. I do know around the house, and when Kathleen was cleaning up the house, there's lists of like everything. He was a really compulsive list maker. And I never quite got down to the bottom of how I wanted to read that or think about it, but he liked to count things, he liked to note things, he liked to know how much he did on a day. I mean, they're all over the place. So certainly there's a lot more to be mined in that. But I came to him first through systems and then had to kind of back up the car and realize there's this really much more interesting interplay. And so that was kind of my process, was systems first and then intuition later.
And I thought of Hamersley as being listless.
He's in the room.
Yeah, to me, all of that stuff he has, all that documentation, is how he thought and worked and lived. And so I don't think it was primarily like, I'm doing great stuff, I want to have all kinds of great data here for the nerds to sort it out 100 years from now. I think it's like that's just how his mind worked, and he couldn't make the paintings without, the books, the framing room, the drawing, the whole shebang. But that's just.
I'm just wondering out loud here. I wonder if, was he of a generation where maybe showing all your work in that kind of methodical, obsessive way wouldn't have been appreciated. Like more that it's supposed to just to come from someplace. You're just a great artist, and by showing your work, maybe he had hung up about that a little bit.
Or even generationally, it might have seemed impolite to sort of have all your
Whereas
dirty
today,
laundry.
I mean, artists are like, correct me if I'm
Show
wrong.
me everything.
Yeah, exactly.
A little discretion would be nice.
Well, I'd like to ask a question on approach, and that issue was raised for me in both in surveying the talks, in which I think, James, just when you stated very clearly that you wanted to sort of withdraw Hammersley from the whole and sort of bring him into contact with different other artists, art historical ideas that we're familiar with, but Hammersley might not have been in touch with. And then, Joe, your final slide of showing the 3 different segments, but really giving us the survey. And this might be an impossible question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is one approach necessary in terms of understanding the breadth of Hammersley's art, or is it sort of where we are in what we know about Hammersley that now, James, sort of your approach in inserting him into a larger narrative, art historical or cultural, is really more, I guess, revelatory? And, I guess it's more of a question on, we need to, it almost sounds like we need to know the whole in order to understand the personality driving the art, but yet there's also so much to be offered in connecting him with technology, larger abstraction, larger movements of abstraction. So I just invite your comments in thinking about approaches to thinking about Hammersley.
Well, I think he's an important artist, and I want him to have a kind of bigger set of people talking about him and engaged with him. And one strategy for that is explaining how he relates or doesn't relate to things beyond Hammersley. And so that's kind of at a really kind of basic getting the word out way. That's what motivated my thought bubbles, as I call them today. But there's just like a ton to talk about just within Hammersley. like it's pretty much inexhaustible. So there's other approaches, of course.
I think because so much information has been revealed by Hammersley's death, that there is a whole range of new work that can be done as a result. Patrick Frank has a book coming out from Museum of New Mexico Press, late fall, early winter, on computer drawings, and I think that couldn't have happened before Hammersley passed away. And I think that the breadth of what he did has spurred some other discussions about art making and the cultural context of art making in the late 40s and early 50s, what happened in the 60s, what's happening after that. Hammersley has benefited in some ways from time. And as we look back, his work looks better and better year by year.
I think we should also acknowledge the incredible work done by the foundation, the estate, the legacy, and the way that they brought the work to our attention as curators and critics who, really just didn't know about it. Maybe it was in our collections, but it was one piece. But by placing the work is what they did so well in important institutions with curators and art historians who cared. They are, continuing or expanding or allowing that to happen.
And piggybacking on that, I want to do a shout out to LA Louvre, the gallery in LA, where they've a series of just fantastic shows that opened my eyes to Hammersley, going way back to the early 90s. He was new. I moved to LA in '89. I didn't know who he was, and all of a sudden there was a show. And it's like, wow, you better figure out who this guy is. And then be show after show of putting big groups together.
So at this time, I'd like to open up questions or comments to the audience, and there is a microphone going around, so if you'll just raise your hand and someone will bring that to you.
I was just curious. I'm getting the impression that he was almost a hermit, that he was very self-motivated, that he wasn't particularly looking for commentary or companionship from the art community, and also living in Albuquerque, which in my impression probably wasn't really a hotbed at that time, though I could be wrong. So did he have strong friendships with other artists? Did he talk about his work with other artists? Did he look at other artists a lot? Travel to see other artists' work?
I teach out at Claremont Graduate University, and Carl Benjamin used to teach there, and he and Fred always had a competitive phone conversation relationship going on who was making better work, and it was just hilarious to watch, because I think they're both super talented, terrific artists, and they were so. Just like classmates trying to write a better paper, and back and forth. So I know that conversation. They wouldn't hang. I didn't know Carl until near the end of his life, so he wasn't traveling then. But they had a really active phone competition. But I do get the sense that Fred is the kind of artist that it was self-generative and self-sustaining, and to me, there's some artists. Like that, like Lee Bonteque locked herself up in a farm for 40 years and made great work. I couldn't survive without looking at other stuff, but I get the sense that Fred's practice was generative and self-sustaining. Could be wrong.
I knew Fred well for many years, and he. It was a self-sustaining kind of practice, but he also did have relationships with other artists. On the faculty, I was the director of Cameron Institute for many years, and Fred used to come over and he'd walk around and he'd stand in front of the work and he'd look at it by other artists. And he'd stand there and he'd look, and then he'd say, "Now that's odd. Why do you suppose someone would do something like that?" So he was looking at work. I also, with respect to the traveling, I many years ago took a group of, was the docent on an art museum trip to the south of France, and Frederick went along on that trip. Well, I learned more from Frederick than I could have ever taught anybody on that trip. And he was delightful and knowledgeable and really curious and interested about what made the other artists' minds work, I think, was something that I was always struck by.
I'm interested to know how much Hammersley actually talked about the breadth of his work. I'm thinking somebody mentioned a cultural moment, and I'm especially thinking about the 70s and even the 60s and early 80s, where there was this myth of consistency. And your work was supposed to be consistent, and it was talked in reviews and in articles as an asset, and people were suspicious of a lack of consistency. We all knew that artists were being inconsistent in their practices in their studios, and that it was the dealers and maybe more, the curators and collectors, who were focused on some of this. But I'm interested to know how much Hammersley talked about the breadth of his work and the idiosyncratic jumping around.
Fred never talked about his own work. I mean, that just wasn't unbecoming. Yes. I mean, he showed the work and was very proud of it, but had a very personal, private side to his personality. And if you began to broach into that other area, the conversation just sort of died. And he was very private about what he did, and didn't talk about it in terms of, this is what I've done, A, B, C, D, E.
Well, then let me ask it differently. Did he show the breadth of his work?
I think so, but I think that also accounts for why he probably wasn't that well known until more recently, when the consistency demand has, I think, fallen away. I think he was ahead of his time as an artist, and he was going to make whatever he was going to make. Whatever, it's a computer drawing, a photograph, a sculpture, a painting, what kind of cut-up painting. He's going to do what he's going to do, and maybe the world wasn't ready for that. And I think now we're in a time where it's kind of sought after, and I think that accounts for much of the world catching up with Fred.
Part of it is that Hammersley was filled with inconsistencies. So here's an artist who used computers in the 1960s to make art, and then did not own a personal computer, but would send you very short notes typed on a hand typewriter, very short notes. And Fred, if you're listening, if you could send us one of those notes to answer some of these questions, it would be appreciated.
Patrick, one final question, and then we'll have to wrap
Okay.
up.
I'm going to ask if anybody wants to answer this question, great. If you don't, it's okay. Does Hammersley remind you of any other creative person, like a novelist, a poet, a dancer, an actor, or something? And before I ask you to answer, I'm going to tell you what I think.
Please.
He reminds me of Mozart, because Mozart was very effortless in his compositions, and that was because he all had it in his head before he would start to write it down. He would say, I can compose while I'm talking to people or having a drink or whatever, because it's already up there. So Hammersley's paintings, and what brought this home to me was the show that you did, James, to paint without thinking. That's what made that's when it happened to me. He's like Mozart. Mozart is so effortless. So I don't know. What about, does he remind you of any other creator besides what I just said? And it's optional whether you answer or not.
That's a great question, because none of us seem to be able to answer it. I can't think of who it would be. Shostakovich isn't right. Who has kind of complicated politics anyway. But somebody who would kind of gnaw on a bone and set the bone down and come back to it. And that was kind of a thing with him. He never actually put anything down. Because he'd eventually come back to it. And maybe I can light on somebody who's worked that way. But there was this returning that happened over and over right until the end. And somehow composers working over themes or chewing over bits of music seem like might be apropos, but it doesn't actually answer your question.
Ellsworth Kelly, maybe? I don't know.
I had a slide of his in there before.
Yeah. Just as an artist who
from
was
the drawing from color and line.
to figuration, to abstraction, to portraiture, he kind of did it all and didn't, he didn't answer to anyone else but himself, and I felt that too.
Yeah. I think Ron Nagel, I think, is a little bit like him in terms of the kind of intensity of focus, and I'm going to do whatever I want to do, and also has like a life as a musician that no one really knows about because it's a different world.
I would say Patrick Nagatani. Nagatani was another Southern California artist who came to New Mexico. Much of his work was about, he was a photographer, but much of his work was about the bomb and the impact of nuclear energy on communities in New Mexico. But he also did things that were totally inconsistent. So he would take images, often of a Buddhist subject matter, and cover them with translucent tape to make tapestries. that had a very deep meaning to him. He did things that were totally inconsistent, and it had the same sense of humor that Hamersley had, but was in fact a very serious artist who used humor as a weapon in an argument.
Unfortunately, that is the end of our time. Please give our panelists another round of applause, and thank you to you all for coming this afternoon.
Thank you.